In this lecture, we'll continue to survey the historical and literary context of modernism in preparation of our readings of William Butler Yeats, Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot. Last week we talked about how there is a divide in modernism between the low and high modernists. Modernists came to be during a time when the reading population in Britain was booming. The Education Act of 1870 had made elementary school compulsory, led to the expansion of public education, and thus resulted in the emergence of a more literate population. This, alongside the rise of mass-produced popular literature such as yellow press journalism or journalism that was cheap and sensationalized, quickly led to the segmentation of the reading public between the highbrows and the lowbrows, whereas the highbrows admired experimental, avant-garde, radical, and iconoclastic or nonconformative art, and lowbrow refers to popular art or art that is easily accessible, appeals to the masses, and or panders to the lowest common denominator. The modernists we'll be dealing with this week are high modernists. Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot have been seen as particularly and explicitly elitist, not just in the treatment of their own art, but in their comments about the art of others. So typically, high modernists are marked by their experimental form and iconoclasm, but alongside this, you often get artists who seem to turn their noses up at what they consider to be common art. So what does it mean to be avant-garde and iconoclastic? Let's turn to Marcel Duchamp for a quick familiar example. In 1917, he put his infamous fountain on display. Fountain is just a urinal bought from a store, turned upside down, and signed R. Mutt. It has been variously interpreted as distasteful and or revolutionary because it defies, on one hand, the traditional definition of art as something one crafts, as well as on the other hand the traditional concept of art as something that should be ennobling. Here, instead, Duchamp presents a mass-produced, ready-made product that makes art of human waste. One could read this as an attempt to shock the audience out of the deadening, desensitizing elements of everyday urban industrial life, perhaps even to reinvigorate it, but in any case, to this day, it is still debated whether Duchamp's fountain should count as art, and in this way it helps to demonstrate how modernists can at times be seen as elitist. We could also see Duchamp's art as expression of the modernist fascination with big business, due to its origins in the factory, a chief feature of the early 20th century. And this leads us to another phase of modernism which sought to move away from high art and high culture towards instead low art and low culture, or in other words, popular culture, art that is made for the lowest common denominator and or disseminated for the widest audience, including venues made for the masses such as newspapers and radio. Duchamp gives elitist high modernists a twist by using for his subject a product of low culture, something that is mass produced. In this way, he brings in a classic sense of irony common in modernist art. From another perspective, some define modernism as largely a crisis of masculinity, a crisis that struggles to define the new man in the face of this rising new woman. We've already talked about the rise of the new woman last week, but beyond the upheaval of gender norms at home, the British Empire faced many changes. World War I, as mentioned last week, caused many to question the Western myths that science, capitalism, patriarchy, and so forth caused progress and civilization. The British Empire also became more diversified. The settler nations of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were granted the status of dominions, recognizing their relatively independent control over their own internal affairs, and over time these nations would come to be known as the British Commonwealth. From the Commonwealth we start to hear from different voices, including authors like Margaret Atwood, the Canadian author who wrote the 1985 dystopic novel Handmaid's Tale, which some of you might be familiar with from Hulu's TV series of the same name. Back to the beginning of the 20th century, then, the British Empire was pocked by myriad nationalist movements, including those in India and in Ireland. Irish nationalism took shape in particularly violent protests. If you've seen the BBC TV series Peaky Blinders, now on Netflix, the Irish Republican Army that appears on that show is a reference to one type of early 20th century Irish nationalism that fueled this fight for Irish independence. And by 1922, the southern counties of Ireland were declared the Irish Free State. The fight to unite all of Ireland against British rule would continue for the rest of the century, and Irish authors like James Joyce and William Butler Yeats, whom we're reading this week, were significantly shaped by these nationalist impulses. By 1947, Britain, already spent from its part in World War II, lost India as they gained independence alongside Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Kenya, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Barbados, Guyana, and St. Lucia. The 20th century was simply a period of decolonization, and the British Empire dramatically shrunk. Meanwhile, what with the post-war shortage in labor, Britain saw an influx of immigration from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, all informing a modern, multiracial scene in English society, but also forcing poets to rethink what it means to be British. Whereas what it meant to be British used to be clear-cut and fit nicely within the grand narrative of white patriarchy, the collapse of the British Empire invited a literature of pluralities, of various realities, from the regional literature of Ireland to the literatures of the immigrant, post-colonial, feminist, and gay experiences of a post-modern world. So the 19th century and early 20th century had shattered the confidence of old certainties about faith, science, materialism, the empire, and the self. Remember that at this time we're seeing a boom in new technologies and sciences, the ability to move people and information across great distances, sometimes almost instantaneously, with the telegraph, telephone, steamships, railroads, automobiles, and airplanes, as well as the ability to care for exploding populations with advancements in agriculture and medicine that improved nutrition, public health, and infant mortality, resulted not just in industrialization and urbanization processes we see emerging over the course of the 19th century, but mass production. Capitalism is on the rise. Whereas we originally had value systems embodied by the ideologies of humanism that had dominated Western society since the Renaissance, now instead we see the commodification of all meaning, life, and people. As mentioned earlier, it is the capitalist thrust that promotes mass-produced art and prints, and it is the capitalist impulse that redefines 20th century success with money rather than moral, ethical, spiritual, or intellectual value. Some modernist artists rebelled against this rise of capitalism by critiquing institutions and the loss of values, and in this way, as we've said before, modernism can be seen as an extension of romantic individualism and the nature of rebellion cultivated in the early 19th century. But modernism differs from the romantic rebelliousness in that its reality is so much more disorienting. Urbanization and globalization unsettled the grand narratives by which each person understood the world. While populations boomed and cultures began making contact worldwide, people began feeling increasingly alienated. Amid the masses, one can feel lost, alone, and disconnected, and that's exactly what we see happening here. But more than this, modernists felt truly, epistemologically and ontologically lost. That is, modernism is moreover a time of what we call a crisis of representation and reason. Modernists looked at the advancement of sciences and technology and saw how, on one hand, they unwittingly made horrifying things like commodification and war more efficient, while on the other hand, counterproductively stripped emotional and spiritual meaning from the universe. The world wars were apocalyptic, life-changing experiences that ruptured people's worldviews, demarcating the optimism and hope of progression that came before, from the 19th century, from the skepticism, disorientation, and doubt that came after in the 20th century. For if life is nothing but a condensation of atoms and chemical processes, as the sciences were increasingly declaring, then even that which we call reason, to which artists turned during the Enlightenment to perfect humankind, lead to progress, and save cultures from barbarity, demeans our pursuits of meaning. In brief, ironically and paradoxically, modernists came to feel that reason logically dictates that the universe is actually, naturally, and inherently meaningless, and in this way reason no longer appears rational. It's a crisis of reason. Likewise, reality no longer appears real. This is the crisis of representation. Because reality is stripped of meaning, it no longer feels familiar or human, but distant, alien, confusing, and ultimately inhuman. Everything is mass-produced. Laborers are cogs in a machine. Patients are churned out of emerging hospital institutions. Tear gas and machine guns make mere numbers of men. Reality isn't personal, and it doesn't make sense. In the end, modernism can't be just a new kind of romanticism, but a new kind of realism, as it insists that reality should be defined anew for being very unreal in aspect. And from here, modernist literature turns inwards to examine one's self-consciousness and the impossibility of defining oneself in this increasingly meaningless world. Modernist literature becomes more about exploring a self-consciousness that investigates the form and meaning of language, seeking to represent the struggle to know and interpret reality, while reality remains seemingly elusive and unknowable. For some, then, this endeavor is captured by the stream of consciousness technique, or a mode of narration that represents a character's interior flow of thought, allowing readers access to characters' consciousnesses. For others, it involves rebuilding new myths, tacking modern concerns and stories onto the old bones of classical and Christian ones, manipulating a continuation of antiquity with the contemporary. In general, modernists attempted to construct credible new alternatives to the old shattered belief systems.